everybody, this is Bishop John Selders, and welcome to another iteration, another opportunity for us to talk about relevant things. We call this Relevant Conversations, and I am your host, Bishop John Selders. I am Pastor Amistad United Church of Christ and co-founder of More Monday CT. And what we want to do for the next few weeks, is talk about issues that I think are important to us here in the state of Connecticut, but also important to us as we are entering into this new season. Can't y'all feel that something is afoot? There's something very, very, very I don't know. My spiritual senses, my spiritual spider senses are tingling, and they are suggesting to me that there's something going on. There's something happening in the world that we live in, and of course, you know how we roll. If it's something that needs to be talked about, if it's something that has something to do with justice, if it has something to do with righting the wrongs, either historically or right now in present time, in real time, we need to be talking about it. And as people of faith and conscience, we need to be bringing our best selves to the conversation. I am happy to have my partner in a whole lot of these conversations and in a whole lot of this troubling of the spiritual waters, if you will, here in these Connecticut streets. The Reverend Taryn Lepke, who is a staff person and works with Common Cause Connecticut. And let me bring him in from the green room. Hey, brother, how are you?
Hello, Bishop. I'm doing great. How are you?
I am good. I'm good, and I'm glad you were able to join us tonight to talk about the upcoming elections. Not let me just say this so that I don't get all out of whack. The elections are happening across this country, but here in Connecticut, our election day is November the 8th. Is that right? Did I get that right? Yes, November 8th, right? And so what we want to do is in fact add our voices and add our commentary about this upcoming election to bring it to bear. We want to drive people to the polls, man. I'm a black man in America, and so for me, people died in order for me to have the right and privilege and to hold my head up high as I cast my vote. Vote my conscience, vote my choice to the folk and the issues that I find are important. The people that I vote for are the people who I believe will represent my interest in the various spaces and seats that they hold, like anybody and everybody else, right? So elections are important to me. Elections, I believe, are important to those of us who are of faith and of conscience. What's your thought about that?
Well, I have many thoughts about that. One of them is thank you, Bishop Selders, for having me on and being a part of Moral Monday CT and the work and the ministry. And in terms of, look, we live in a state that has a reputation for being, good on things, although we are one of only 4 states in the entire United States of America that does not have early voting. That's what I think about that. One of only 4. The other 3 being another supposedly quote unquote northern, possibly blue. I don't know if New Hampshire qualifies as blue or red. I don't actually know, but New Hampshire is one of the others. And then it's Alabama and Mississippi.
So what you trying to say?
That Connecticut is not the place that people might think it is in terms of our access to the ballot.
That's right. So let's talk a little bit, Reverend Lepke, if you will, about some of the work we've already forwarded and that we've been engaged in. I remember during at the height of COVID, and we were in the lockdown. We were all on the couch. We were sitting in our living rooms and in our dens and at our dinner tables and our dining room tables and the kitchen tables, in fact, both working and doing our activism. We were engaged in what was a fairly revolutionary idea, it seemed, at least here in Connecticut, that we were actually going to vote by mail. What a novel idea. We were going to vote by mail. And I remember during those times, that was 2 years ago. I remember when we arrived here in Connecticut, my family and I, back in 2000, in the year 2000, and we had to vote. We had not quite gotten all registered and gotten it. There was some hiccups along the way, but we were allowed to vote in the presidential election that year, having moved from Chicago here to Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, Hartford particularly, and we were able to vote by mail. We were able to go to City Hall, Town Hall, and request a ballot and actually vote our ticket. And so I remember sharing that story during that season, and to only find out 20 years later, that we really hadn't done that. I mean, while also knowing and understanding that folk have been voting by mail and on what we call absentee ballot since the Civil War, since the 1860s here in Connecticut. What y'all talking about? Talk to us a little bit about where we have come from since that time.
Well, not terribly far. Because an absentee ballot in this state is still restricted to a set of certain excuses that are quote unquote. Let's back up. The fact that it's even called an excuse that you have to have in order to get an absentee ballot, which is enshrined in the Constitution, the fact that you have to have an excuse not to go to your polling place on election day to cast your ballot in person already brings up a certain frame of mind, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what frame of mind does that entail? The fact that you have to have an excuse not to show up in person. Doesn't that already say that showing up in person to cast your ballot is the premium upon which we're going to rest all of our, value? I mean, when the truth is, voting by mail is a very common occurrence. In fact, Colorado has all vote by mail. They only vote via mail in Colorado, and they have some of the most accurate, clean, and stable elections anywhere. And so Connecticut, hasn't changed its statutes. It can't change its statutes on absentee ballots in a serious way until the Constitution is changed, which bars no excuse absentee voting or voting by mail. In many places, they just call it vote by mail. But because we have such a sort of deep fear of change in this state, to even call it vote by mail, some people thought aligned it too far with a left political viewpoint, and they stuck with the technical term of no excuse absentee ballots. Now, what's easier to say, no excuse absentee voting or vote by mail?
Right.
Okay, so even just in our linguistic approach to the franchise of voting, we already encounter an obstacle because we can't say vote by mail because it's politically incorrect in Connecticut. We have to say no excuse absentee voting to already locate us within the conversation that we must change the Constitution in order to make it actually possible for anybody who's an eligible voter to vote by absentee ballot or by mail, instead of adhering to one of 5 specific reasons that you're supposed to supply if you want to do so. So I'm just breaking down that we're so far away in Connecticut from a sense of freedom about access to the ballot that we don't even know it.
So here we are. We're in 2022, right? We're in 2022. The year 2022. We're one of 4 states that doesn't have this, what I would call center jewel to whatever this thing we call democracy is, this experiment, this democratic experiment, this democratic republic experiment we call the United States of America. We're one of 4 states, Mississippi and Alabama being 2 of the other 4. And you said New Hampshire, right? Yeah. That doesn't have something already in place. So okay,
so early voting, yeah.
With early voting in particular, or absentee ballot, that we have to have an excuse. You got to be out of town or something to even participate in this. So what we're talking about, folks, is what's already going to be a ballot measure in the election on November 8th here in the state of Connecticut, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about one of the things that will be on the ticket, on the ballot, November 8th, is what we are naming this moment, early voting, that almost every other state in the United States of America already does.
Right. And the question is, do people know that is on the ballot? And do they know what early voting is? Because in this state, it's been the land of steady habits. It's been forever that it hasn't existed. And now it's on the ballot, which, so early voting is the opportunity to show up in this case, early in-person voting is what we're talking about. It's early in-person voting. So it's the opportunity to show up and vote at some period of time. And states vary in their lengths of time that it's available before election day to cast your ballot. The reason being, let's say the home care worker has, works all day long on election day and can't afford to take the day off on that one day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why wouldn't it make sense to offer another day for that person to exercise arguably the most important single right that they possess as a human, which is the right to vote?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So okay, so we got that. Let's move on to talk a little bit about what else is happening here in the state of Connecticut this year. 2022 here in Connecticut is our statewide offices. They are up. Our state legislature every 2 years empties, right? And each seat is elected for. So people who currently hold those offices have to be reelected in our state legislature. Both sides, both houses, the Senate and the House, they get elected every 2 years. And then we have the opportunity this year to vote for what I call our constitutional offices. That is our governor, our lieutenant governor, the secretary of the state, our treasurer, and our comptroller. Right? Those are the what we call our constitutional offices. Right? And then of course you got the House and the Senate, the state House and the state Senate. In our state Senate, we have 36 state senators. Isn't that right?
Yep.
All right. And in our state House, we have, now help me with this number. We have 156, I think 150 or 160. I'm making that number up, and I should get that number absolutely right. We have 151 spots. Right?
I think it's 152.
Okay, it's something like that. I'm making it up. I'm going off the top of my head. Spots that are available in this election.
151. 151. You're right.
Yeah, 151. We had some redistricting. Woo! I want to talk about that later. We can't talk about that in a whole lot of time later, but I think one of the things that's of interest to me is how we district our districts. Just a side note, Pamela and I had the opportunity to spend some time with some political types and folk on last night. And shout out to Sister Adrian Billing and Pamela. I'm blanking on Ace's last name, so help me. Ace invited us to an event, and I heard tell that one of our state office holders, their opponent, had to pull out of the race because they hadn't checked. They were running for an office outside of their district because the district had been redistricted. When does that happen in I know it doesn't happen only in a place like Connecticut, but it seems like I only hear about it in places like Connecticut, right? But this is a very interesting, set of circumstances, quite frankly, but that happens regularly, that we don't often give any kind of mental assent or thought about at all. That every several years, your district gets redistricted, and that there is a conversation afoot by the people who currently hold the offices and whose interests are represented by the folk who currently hold those offices. They get in a room and have a conversation about how the district gets drawn. So I think that's a conversation, and for a different day and a much wider conversation. But here we are, 151 seats. We have Democrats and Republicans, working families, party folk running. You got independents, you got Green Party candidates, you got Libertarian Party candidates, and then you got some that just create parties to run for a particular office. And so that's happening all over the state of Connecticut. All over the state of Connecticut. They're all. We happen to live in district here in Hartford, District Number 1. For our state senator, I think is District Number 1. And I think for our rep, we live in, I don't forget what district it is, but it's a very interesting day. And we have the interesting, well, let me stop there. Let me pause, because I got a couple of things I want to ask you about. But how are things summing up in your area, and how are things summing up in terms of voter participation and what I would call the buzz that's on the street related to the election?
Well, I mean, honestly, I feel like that participation, we always hope for it to be higher, and in an election, in a midterm election year, it generally is not as high as in say a presidential election year, but we know that it is absolutely incumbent upon all of us to do everything we can to get everybody out to vote. Honestly, because I work in a nonpartisan capacity, working on campaigns for voting rights like early voting and no excuse absentee voting and other, and a Connecticut Voting Rights Act and all of these things. I don't think it's just because I work in it, but I am hearing a lot about early voting. I suppose that is because I work in it. But we're trying to make sure that conversation gets outside of sometimes what I call the Connecticut Beltway of 5 or 6 people that are paying attention to what's going on, and gets out into the wider world. So I don't so much put a lot of stock on what I hear going on, like on the insider beat. It's more like, how are we projecting the fact that people get to actually decide on November 8th if they want to change the state constitution to allow early voting. I mean, it's a historic event, and we need to do everything we can to get, which is why we think it's worth recruiting poll standers for early voting on election day. And we don't have to do it now, but at some time I want to break down why that is. We think that it's worth doing stipends for poll standers on election day for early voting, in addition to recruiting volunteers, which is something different for our work this time around. But we don't have to do it now. But I do want to circle back to it if we don't, around the poll standing operation and educating the public as they're coming into the polls on the fact that it's on the ballot. So honestly, I'm surrounded by that conversation so much right now, Bishop, that it's hard for me to even think outside. I am not even on the ground really with what's going on the state house and state rep fronts for my area, partially because I live in solidly, I live in districts that, Senator Looney is my state senator, and Senator and state rep Josh Elliott is my state rep, both of whom perform well on voting rights. Although I must say we should never take that for granted, because remember how you were just talking about this wild idea to have no excuse to be able to vote by mail. We had to have a big fight to have that in the middle of COVID, for everybody to be able to do. And you think that would have been a no-brainer, but it was a struggle to get it to actually move. You remember, because you were there. So anyway, that's my answer. Is I'm trying to do everything I can in every conversation to get early voting out into the world, lest it fail like it did in 2014.
Right. That's right. So let's spend just a little bit more time here, because what I found interesting in coming to Connecticut, I too believed that this was a fairly liberal space politically. And what I have come to understand, that can be taken in some really broad understandings of what liberality means. And what I've also come to know is that this place moves slow. Somebody referred to it as the land of steady habits.
Yeah.
Right. And so the notion that we would have to open up the state constitution to allow for something that everybody in this democracy should be able to participate in without any barrier became a kind of a deal. And I was a little I was a little surprised about it, by the way. I mean, the conversation around the actual ballot boxes, where those early vote you could pull up to your town hall, where we had some voter registers wanted not to have those boxes in front of those town halls. It was all kinds of weird, strange, you would have thought we were down south in the 1940s and 50s.
Yes.
In the way people characterized and talked about, voting ought to happen on election day and no other day and no other time, and without all of what we were managing and navigating in 2020.
Yeah. Right. And whose interest does that serve, by the way, to narrow it down and lock it down to one 14-hour day? Who are the people who? Well, we just have to look at the numbers, and we have to look at where things are at. I mean, it's working for someone.
Well, here's what I'm gonna say, and this is all I'm gonna say. Those who sit in power, it's in their best interest to have it remain controllable, to have it remain a small group of people. And of course, in that instance, Black and brown people lose.
Okay.
So I'm gonna just say that and say it just as direct as I can. I can talk about Hartford because this is where I live. In a town that's about 125,000 in population, we have about 80,000 people who are registered to vote. And at any given time, I think the biggest vote that people participated in numerically in recent history and memory was the election of President Obama in 2008 and then in 2012. I can tell you here, there was, of that, okay, say 120, 125,000 people in population, with about 80,000, let's say 70, 80,000 people who were eligible to vote, who were registered to vote. Only about 30 to 35,000 people voted. So less than half of the people who were eligible to vote, who were registered to vote, actually participated. And we call that huge numbers. I'm surprised at that.
Yes, and let's, of course, Bishop, and let's not forget that when you look at the numbers in Connecticut, for example, we went back and looked in Hartford in 2014. You were here, I was not, so you know better than I. You live in Hartford, I do not. I'm just looking at numbers. In 2014, on the very same ballot that Malloy was running against Foley v. Malloy in 2014. On that very same ballot was the early voting constitutional amendment that narrowly failed by 4% statewide, after there was a pretty sizable campaign to try to get the public word out. And but what we found, and normally, a person, if they're going to a polling place to vote, it's because they already know who they're going to vote for, right? Mostly. Wouldn't you agree or not? You can disagree.
I do agree. You kind of, when you leave the house, you know kind of who you getting ready to vote for. There may be some game time decisions you get in the polling booth, and but for the most part, most of us leave the house already, or leave our places of work, headed to the poll knowing who we were going to vote for. That, I would agree with that.
But in 2014, even if you probably knew who you were going to vote for and you lived in Hartford, in some of the highest Black and brown population communities in the state, did you even know that early voting was on the ballot? Had anyone told you? Right? Was there any kind of actual big public outreach campaign in the cities and the urban centers around that? And the answer almost certainly seems to be that, despite good efforts, not really, because when we looked at, let's see, in Hartford, of all the voters that voted Democrat for Malloy on that ballot in Hartford, over 56% of those people did not vote yes on that ballot question. What does that say?
Well, this stuff, these kinds of statistics, this kind of information should drive us to think about, what went wrong.
What went wrong? And
right?
And Bishop, I'm not screen sharing the numbers, but when you look at the top urban center, high BIPOC population, Black and brown community polling places across the state, it's in all the big towns. That's also where all the big share of voters are in terms of numbers, right? And so the fact that somebody didn't do a good enough job in BIPOC communities on educating about the fact that they could change the Constitution to throw off a couple of hundred years of white supremacy and sort of lockdown on the ballot box, that wasn't out there, means that the ballot question failed. And it didn't fail because out in rural white towns people didn't know about it, because they did. Those voters on the Malloy vote did vote in favor of that ballot question, and I can show you all the spread of the numbers. But we think it's really worthwhile to have people out at the high peaks of on election day between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. and between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. poll standing, which is where you physically stand outside the electioneering line with a little palm card, a flyer that says, early voting. And because I think that we can catch a lot of people on the way in the door who know they're going to vote for somebody. They're pretty sure they know who it is. You're not going to change their mind by trying to talk to them at the last second about their candidate, probably. But you might just educate them to the fact that they didn't know that early voting was something they could vote for that day. And if you don't know what a ballot question is, or didn't know about it, what are the chances you're going to even vote on it?
Well, I'm going to say I am not somebody that spends their work life in these conversations. So I'm the first to admit that. But I do pay attention to matters that are important to Black and brown folk and margined people of all sorts in urban centers here in Connecticut. Let me rephrase what a bit of what you said. Here in Connecticut, our urban centers, that's Bridgeport, Waterbury, Hartford, New Haven, New London, Stanford, Willimantic. I mean, there are some of these spaces and places that are Danbury, that are towns, they're cities, they're small cities. There are urban centers here. The largest number of persons of color live in those towns, these cities, and they are the largest single voting block in any of Connecticut, in all of Connecticut. Yeah. And so we know in just 4 years ago, in the last gubernatorial election, that the margins of one of our friends said Meriden. Thank you. Meriden is a city. It's a small city, Middletown. I got in trouble yesterday because I didn't call all the town. Hamden. I'm calling Hamden today. Y'all ain't gonna come for me tonight. Y'all ain't gonna come for me tonight. It's in these towns that actually Black and brown people who vote make the difference.
That's right.
That's right. And we gotta reckon with that Black and brown folk in these urban centers, they are the majority in population, make the difference in elections.
Yes.
When you go to the poll and when you vote, whatever you vote, whoever you vote for, and for whatever you vote, you use the power, the right of your vote for. It makes a difference in our electoral politics. The issues that are important to you must be held by the people you vote for. And listen, that's all right. If they mess up, if they do too bad, vote them out of there and get somebody else in there. I mean, this is how we hold people accountable. And I find it odd, quite frankly, that when you engage in and I would call these simple conversations in the context of Black and brown people, when there have been so many obstacles and barriers to the right to vote, that we then sit back and don't vote. Now, let me just say this as well, and to be fair and honest, I do understand that sometimes you got to hold your nose. That the candidates don't. Yeah, some of y'all know me, so you know I'm struggling to say the right thing. I get that, but whoever it is, it's a great deal of pride and joy that 2 generations ago, my grandparents were blocked from voting. There were poll taxes. Yeah. And there were questions that they had to answer in order to get to. While they had the right to vote, there were barriers blocking them to vote. Yes. Today, those don't exist in the same way, and yet there are other kinds of ways in which people don't vote, and those are some of these invisible barriers. What you're speaking to, that people didn't even know that stuff was on the ballot. That sometimes folk don't know when you ask them, is that important? They've never heard anybody even articulate a one way or the other about the vote. So I find that's the reason we're doing what we're doing, and the reason we'll be on every Monday up until the election here, is to be talking about issues that are important to us as we consider what we do and why we vote.
Amen. I mean, and don't you think the lack of access Connecticut was the very first state, has the illustrious honor of being the first state to use racist literacy tests in voting.
That's exactly right. So it's interesting. We also too don't know our own history about the right to vote. We had the first. Now I'm letting the cat out the bag a little bit about. Some of y'all know I love history, and I'm a history buff. Not just a buff. I love history. Period. We had the first Black person to sue the Connecticut state legislature, our legislature, for the right to vote. And his petition, his suit, was in 1823, I believe. And what he said is, listen, I work in this state. You take my taxes. Shouldn't I also have the right, if in fact I work every day and you collect my taxes, shouldn't I also have a say as to who, in fact, I vote for in order for you all to collect my taxes and the policies that they enact and the rules by which we do what we do in this state? Shouldn't I have that right as well? Somebody said in the revolutionary era, you know, representation, taxation, isn't that a thing? Isn't that a thing?
Taxation without representation.
Right. So there's a short-sightedness to our memory, right? Now, of course, let me finish our story. The Black person that did sue, lost that suit.
Mm-hmm.
It took 50, 60 years in order for Black people, after that suit in 1823, in order for Black people to vote here in the state of Connecticut. It took the act of the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War for that to come into full effect. Now, that is not to say that we didn't have some Black people who voted, but let's really be clear. People who voted in Connecticut historically at the beginning were white and male and owned land.
Right.
Uh-huh. So there is a trajectory about this vote thing, right? That if we started, and I believe that, let's just tell the truth and share what we know about this history, that then makes the case that for folk to, in fact, go out to the polls. And thank you. And there are, I would say, legitimate reasons why people don't vote. And I want to engage with people, you know, about that. I want to engage with folks. There's some legitimate reasons why. I happen to think, you know, as I have gone on record and as I'm saying here tonight, my folk risked too much, and in order for me to take that for granted today. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And let me ask you, Bishop, do you feel like that so we're only one of 3 states in the nation that bars early voting in its constitution? I just feel like, as a white man, that I don't have a place to really say a whole lot, but that I have this feeling that finally allowing early voting is a stepping stone in that same trajectory of throwing off these invisible barriers to especially Black and brown people in this state with respect to the ballot.
Yeah, you already know what I'm going to say about that, right? That there are these invisible barriers that you know, yes, there are choices people make, and amen to the choices people make, right? But there should not be, by law, these barriers that are just ridiculous. This would be something else if we were one of 3 or 4 states that were trying to do this. But the vast majority of, if you move from here to Colorado, this is how they vote. Washington State, this is how they vote. They send in a ballot, you know, from a period of time to the election day. This is what they do. It's got to be postmarked by the election day.
There's a whole month of early voting in Chicago.
There's
a whole month, and everybody's used to it. And if you tried to take it down to a week, which is what the leading supposedly progressive voices running for state, I'm gonna get in trouble now. I've heard people say maybe we'll get a week of early voting in Connecticut. That sounds good. And I'm coming from Chicago, where it's been a month for as long as anybody can remember, and you're used to being able to go at your own time at a place that makes sense. Anyway, just the fact that we're so closed off about it, Bishop Selders, it just drives me crazy. We need help getting this message out that throwing off these barriers is part of like the process of providing space for people to have the conversations that get them motivated to get through their aversions to voting. Yes, there's a lot of terrible politicians, absolutely. But anyway, we just got to throw off these invisible things that are holding people down, and I don't have hardly any of them being a white man in this society, but I want to be, to the best of my ability, in the struggle alongside people to help make these things change. So
I hear you. Let me tell you what's also of importance to me as we talk about the right to vote. It is, in fact, a right. It is something that has been afforded every citizen of these United States, and in this state of Connecticut in particular. You live here, you pay taxes here, you have the right to go to the poll and vote. There are so many meaningful everyday systems and policies and things that happen every day that if in fact you don't vote, then you leave it to other people who may or may not represent your interest around that. I'm thinking about Flint, Michigan,
right
now, who right now today their drinking water is jacked up. Now, in here in Hartford, we had a situation where there's been a lot of deferred maintenance vis-a-vis the water district, and we had one of these kind of what I would call referendums around paying a little bit more money, right? And then making sure that the systems were renovated and replaced in some cases. That's great. Isn't that great? Everybody wants clean water, right? Except there were precedent court cases that said the water district was already, liable to, in fact, do the work without this referendum ballot initiative that was placed on the ballot, so that the water district had to pay for that deferred maintenance and for the upkeep of the water system and the water delivery, right? But we ended up paying, because of lack of information, the folk in this district and in this region end up paying more money for what was already theirs to have, because the water company lost that fight. It was because it was for a lack of information. It was for a lack of information that the general public didn't understand. Everybody wanted clean water. Now we got water is an issue not only in Flint in a national discourse, it's also Jackson, Mississippi, where deferred maintenance in a very similar way, along with white flight, left that city in a terrible situation, where now they have similar efforts that are going on. We're sending water and we're helping folk day for day in Jack. This is 2022, and yet here we are in this allegedly great country, wealthy country, where we're having, many people are struggling for what I call clean water. And that's just one example. I mean, our educational system is horrid. All right. Our healthcare system jacked up, needs work. The cost alone for medicines is ridiculous. People are making money hand over fist over fist over hand over fist over fist, and it ain't people like me and my people like you and others who are benefiting from that, right? So I think for me, the rationale for the vote is much related to the fact that the folk who we do elect ought to be representing our interest in a way that the rights, the laws, the policies they enact and put in place are to help us live better, live safer, live more healthy, right? And for me, that's at the core of what I believe the vote offers us, and the opportunity to participate in our own governing in that way. Okay, I'm off my preaching box, although I am a preacher, so kind of what I do on from time to time.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. So we just got a few more minutes. And Taryn, you certainly will invite you back, and want you to talk a little bit more about the programs you all are running, and we'll spend more time, kind of fleshing that out so folk will know exactly how they can participate. But in our remaining little bit of time here, what would you say that's of import, and what's on your mind tonight around the election coming up in, let's say, 36 days?
Well, to not vote is to vote, is to vote for whoever ends up winning. So it would be good to at least know who looks like they might win, because if you don't vote, you're kind of voting for them. And if you don't like them, you better get out and vote against them. But what's of import is that, honestly, we actually need to figure out with folks in Hartford who can help put paid poll standards on the ground to help educate the public in the polling places in Hartford, to make sure people know coming in the door that early voting is on the ballot. That's what's of import. And we have the ability to provide paid stipends for these folks, including training. So that's what I want to move forward with, is seeing if there's a way we can cover these polling places on election day, so that the Constitution gets amended by the Black and brown communities of Hartford and the other major areas in the city. Unlike last time around, where there wasn't enough education and people who would have voted for it just didn't know about it, I guess. We got to make sure people know. And that's our main thing right this second, is getting that word out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I am I and my co-founder, Pamela Selders, we're in, and we will use the voices that we have, the platforms that we have, and the spaces and places where we are at least heard, and have a space to be heard, to talk through some of what I think are important realities around the vote, and to be in conversation. I don't make a claim for being right all the time, but what I do is I want to engage in thinking, and engage in a conversation about how folk, what you think and what you feel. Ultimately, I want to motivate you or inspire you to act, right? And in this country, this so-called democracy, we have the right to vote. I'm reminded what Malcolm X talked about. He talked about it's either the ballot or the bullet. He made it very clear in one of his speeches later in his life. At the time, we didn't know. He was talking to us very directly and very prophetically. And in that speech, he talked about either we're going to use the ballot in order to work in one sense toward our freedom and our liberation, or it's going to be the bullet. And then he made it very stark and very clear. I think we're in some very circuitous times today, where stories and narratives are woven around things I just don't believe are the truth, and yet get actualized in ways that are just remarkable, and quite difficult for me to to work with. So I believe we are at in a time where these conversations are to be had, and I'm committed, and we're committed. More Monday CT, um, and many of our friends are committed, and so I'll say this to those of you who are watching and those who will be watching. Stay tuned. More Monday is on the case. More Monday CT is on the case. We'll be having some conversations. We got some guests that are going to be joining us over these next few Mondays. Pay attention to what we're putting out and posting up. We will be in multiple conversations over the next few weeks leading up to the election. I'm convinced that what happens today will bode very much important to our future and our near future, in relationship to what we have to live with, and let's don't wait another 10 years, almost 10 years, to do this again. Let's get this done. Let's get this ballot initiative passed so that we eradicate the barriers forever to the right to vote in this particular way in the state of Connecticut. How about that, y'all? Y'all, you just consider it. That's what I'll say. Thanks, Reverend Taryn. I appreciate you very much for joining us tonight and being able to be on. We'll be talking more about the issues that are facing us in these coming weeks. Appreciate you coming, joining us. Appreciate you all who are watching and listening, and you all talking to us. If you have any further questions or want us to talk about some issues that are important to you, message us, inbox us, and we certainly will consider it. All right. Again, thanks, Reverend Lepke, for joining us, and we'll see y'all next week. All right. We'll see you next time. This is Relevant Conversations with Bishop John Selders. Thank you for joining us. Peace.